total result each week as we travel through. This week is all about telling your story. How many of you know that quite probably your testimony is probably the best tool that you've got, because it's your story, isn't it? Yeah. You don't have to remember it. So you might not want to remember certain parts of it, but it's there, isn't it? It's your lived experience. It's a really powerful tool. So we're going to explore and unpack that, particularly in this evening. Last week we looked a little bit around what is evangelism, and then we started looking at how to communicate the gospel. The week before that, our first week, we looked at the journey and read words, carrying actions, spirit empowered, and all that kind of knits together. And this week we're going to look at your story. Next week, we're looking at how to handle tricky questions. It's a biggie, isn't it? The week after that, we're going to be looking at how you can help somebody to become a Christian. And then the week after that, we're going to be looking at how we can pray for our friends. And basically, that's what that plays in personal evangelism. That's just a little bit of a reminder of where we're going. So, with that in mind, this week we're looking at telling your story. So I mentioned a couple of books for you that have got some testimonies in. I find that other people's testimonies are also helpful to talk about in your filing cabinet, aren't they? So you've got your own story, but actually, for example, if somebody's going through suffering, but that's not been really your lived experience particularly, then actually having some other people's testimonies of how they've navigated suffering and believed in God and experienced God being with them is really helpful and powerful. Similarly, when it comes to things like science, if you're not from a scientific background and somebody says to you, oh, well, science has disproved it all, and you think, oh, what on earth do I say? And actually to be able to use the testimony of somebody who's a prominent scientist can be a really helpful thing. And so this book here, look closer, mentioned it last week, it's basically the gospel message, but littered throughout lots and lots of testimonies of everyday people, lots of you well-known people. Not that their testimonies are more powerful than your testimony, it's just that sometimes those names can really draw people in. When we talked about last week, attention, getting people's attention, things like that can just really grab people's attention. So yeah, lots and lots of testimonies in that book. Similarly, in this book here, so that book's ready for people to explore the Christian faith, but really looking for it. This book here is ready to kind of nudge the atheists to consider there could be a God. It's not a full gospel preach, but it's really aimed at just nibbling away at an atheist and getting to think, oh, maybe there's a God. And people that you know think, oh, it's not really for me. Have you ever had that? It's fine for you, it's not really for me. Well, this book nudges people. I mean, I really like Christmas. So I can understand people that get fed up of seeing Christmas adverts and Christmas things in shops in September. I understand. I get along next year. I don't mind. My friend once said to me, he said, I'm fed up of all this commercialisation of Christmas. And I said, I hear what you're saying, but to be honest with you, while it's commercialised, Christmas is still in people's minds. And so for me as a Christian, I'm thinking, okay, I don't like that Christmas is commercialised, but it keeps Christianity on the agenda for people. And so I think it gives us a real opportunity. And Christmas is still the easiest and best way, best time and best season to be able to talk about Jesus. People who come to carol services who won't come to anything else, won't they? And so I just think it's such an incredible opportunity to grab. And so what I did is, just very briefly, I took certain phrases, things that we hear, things that we see around Christmas, and I've used those to unpack something to show that Jesus makes a difference in a person's life. And so that's why it's called Not Just for Christmas. The Dog's Trust, which is quite a well-known charity in the UK, many years ago, people were buying dogs for Christmas, and then after they were abandoning them, and they were really concerned. So that's how they commissioned somebody to get this advert out. So they realised people were just buying puppies for presents for people at Christmas, and then forgetting about them for life. So that's the idea. Let's not just kind of get Jesus out at Christmas and then put him away with the decorations. Let's understand that actually he makes a very, very real difference in our lives, and that's part of our testimony, isn't it? So what you can do is you can buy a book. If you buy, it's £4. If you buy 10, it comes out to £3 each. I'm very encouraged, if you don't mind me saying, I feel like I've known you long enough. I'm very encouraged. It came out first week of September and it sold 3,500 so far. So I've just contacted the publisher. We've taken a bit of a step of faith to order another print run of 5,000 because I've got lots of churches to think about buying big numbers. So I'm super encouraged. You don't mind me sharing that, do you? I'm just really, really chuffed by it. So yeah, it's well, you know what? Even if you do, I've just shared it. I'm sorry. So super encouraged about this book. Why not think about people that we hear each week, as I mentioned? Why not think about people who maybe you might struggle to get a conversation about faith? Why don't you think, okay, who are those people? Maybe buy them one for Christmas and then pray that God will give you an opportunity to share your testimony and your story. So there you go. That's not just for Christmas. Right, okay. Enough of the adverts. Let's crack on with talk about telling your story. So, many years ago, I was probably a little bit more excited than I should have been when I received a summons through my letterbox to go to court. Now, I hadn't been a bad lad. I was summoned to jury service. Anybody done jury service? Oh, I loved it. Honestly, I know that most people are going, I really don't know. But when I was a kid, I wanted to be a lawyer. And I wanted to kind of get up the ranks and become a judge. So I'm really fascinated by law. My favourite programs are programs where they're proving cases and showing you how they investigated things. So I really love that kind of stuff. So I was a little bit excited when I received this invitation to go and be on jury service. 2 weeks. So I went down, and you don't really get a choice. You kind of have to do it unless you've got some really extenuating circumstance. Basically, you have to do it. It's quite a formal thing. So we went in, and what happens? It's really fascinating. What happens is there's more than 12 of you, and they select 12 out of, I can't remember, let's say 20. They select 12 out, and then you have to make sure that you're not in any way conflicted. You don't know anybody or anything like that. And then basically, when you're selected and everything's fine, you come into the jury box where you sit, and before anything else happens, before anybody else comes in, the judge says, you are the judge of the evidence, I am the judge of the law. So he's there only to make sure that everything that happens is legal. That was his job. My job and my other 11 colleagues, our job was to listen to what was being said and decide whether the person was guilty or not guilty. And then the judge said to us, sometimes you'll wish there was more evidence, but there isn't. All you've got to do is look at the evidence that you've got. Don't worry about the evidence that you don't have. Worry about the evidence that you've got. Look at that evidence, and you have to decide from that evidence whether the person is guilty or not guilty. So we went through the swearing-in process, and the various cases started. And one particular case, it was really fascinating. One particular case, there was no scientific evidence available. All we had was the evidence given by the word of a witness giving their testimony. And in fact, for this one particular case, there were no external witnesses either. It was basically the person that smacked the person and the person that received the smacking. In other words, the smacker and the smacking. That's what I call it. That's not a legal phrase. That was my own particular slang on it. And yet there were 4 witnesses. It's like crazy. There was nobody else that observed it. There was no scientific evidence available. No, we simply had to listen to this person say, this is what happened, they did it. And for this person to say, this is what happened, I didn't do it. And I'm thinking, give me some help. Do you know what I mean? That's all we had to go on. It's bonkers, isn't it? And yet, the legal system in the United Kingdom deems the word of a witness giving first-hand experience to be sufficient, giving their testimony. It's not Christian phrases, but we use this, don't we? Witness, testimony, but these are legal phrases. Our legal system deems that sufficient evidence for a jury of 12 people to say guilty or not guilty. And I found that really, really fascinating. Interesting, is it, when people talk about proof for God? So often, we're not going to say too much more about this particular thing, because we're going to unpack it a little bit next week. But when people talk about proof, they often talk about scientific proof, don't they? They want scientific proof that God is real, or that this is real, or that, or they say things like, well, in fact, it's been proved that it's not real. And they mean scientifically. And yet, in truth, proof, evidence is just as valid when there's no scientific proof, but it's the word of a witness giving their testimony. And I came away that day thinking, well, isn't that interesting? So I want to say to you, actually, and sometimes I say this to people, if they were trying to prove whether God was real or not, if they were being objective as a jury, they'd have to listen to the word of a testimony from a witness. Do you know where we're going with this? Yeah. So actually, your testimony, your story is really important, because it's your story, and it's legally admissible in a court of law in terms of giving evidence to proof. Now, more importantly than all of that is also a biblical thing. Let me take you to this fantastic account. We're not going to read it particularly because we're not doing a Bible study, but I do just want to reference it. You'll know this story quite well. It's John chapter 9, the story of a man born blind. And I'm sure you've heard this preached many times. But there was a change in this man. He wasn't the same. And those who knew him knew it. So look at verse 8. Isn't this the man who used to? Isn't this the man who used to? I think sometimes the longer we've been a Christian, we can forget the changes that God has made in our lives, or the difference that God has been in our lives, because we get so used to it, don't we? We get so used to it. And some of you might be disheartened with where you are now in your faith. Well, just take a few moments to think about where you were and give God glory and thanks for that, because we're not the same. And this man wasn't the same, and those who knew him knew it. Some of you who haven't been brought up in a Christian home, but you've become a Christian like myself. I wasn't brought up in a Christian home. You became a Christian. Sometimes one of the hardest places we can feel to share our testimonies with people that know us and family. And even those that have been Christians a long time, it can be a really difficult place. But especially when they say things, yeah, but I know what you used to be like. And we go, oh no, they know what I used to be like. I say, praise God, they know what you used to be like. So they've seen a difference. My dad, I would say we weren't brought up in a Christian home. My dad classed himself as a lazy atheist. I don't know whether I've said that to you before. He decided there was no God, but he couldn't really be bothered to find out whether it was true or not. That was his definition. My mum had been brought up in a very strict Catholic family, went to a very strict Catholic school where it was kind of beat into you, really. And so she didn't feel particularly positive about it all. And so when we became Christians, it's really, really funny. We became Christians on a Sunday night, and Dad went into work on the Monday morning, and he didn't feel particularly different. He didn't feel it. He knew that something had happened, but he didn't feel particularly different. My dad was a manual labourer. Him and his brother owned a company that built raw iron railings and steel structures for extensions and buildings and such like. And His dad and his brother ran the sort of admin business side of it, and dad ran the shop floor side of it, when he did a lot of the measuring for jobs. This one particular Monday, dad started at 7 o'clock in the morning, but it got to about 10 o'clock in the morning, and one of his colleagues, he was actually a family member, said to him, "Jim, are you all right?" And my dad said, "Yeah, why? What do you mean?" He said, "It's just that you've been here for 3.5 hours now, and I haven't heard you swear once." Isn't this the man who uses it? Yeah. How many of you know that, yes, there's still a long way to go, but Jesus has made a difference in our lives? And some of you can quantify what that difference is. Some of you know that there's still a work in progress. We're going to talk a little bit about that, about how we balance the sharing of what's happened and what is still happening, and how we share that and articulate that out in our story. But he wasn't the same. My dad wasn't the same. And those who knew my dad and those who knew this man knew that he wasn't the same. And that began then to raise an interest. So in verse 10 in John 9, and then a little bit later on, again in verse 26, they ask the same type of question. How then were your eyes opened? What did he do? Have you noticed that people are generally quite fascinated by why we're Christians? They might start to ask a question. Some might not be particularly bothered, but some are, and they've got these questions that they ask. And of course, this poor guy, he hasn't got a clue, has he? He's literally only just encountered Jesus. He didn't really know or not. And they were asking things like, was this person changed? Was he a sinner? How did he do it? What did he do? And he says in verse 25, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know is I was blind, and now I see. And that's the testimony, isn't it? That's the testimony we're looking at sharing. I don't always know the ins and outs. And I want to say to you, however long you've been a Christian, you might think you've been a Christian for 30 seconds. Well, if you've been a Christian for 30 seconds, you've got a testimony worth telling. Because the strength of our testimony is not about how bad we've been. It is about how good he is. That's the strength of our testimony. For those of you who've been a Christian, like ever since you were born, you sort of popped out your mum's tummy wearing a fish badge. Do you know what I mean? You don't remember a time when you weren't a Christian. That's still a powerful testimony. We don't have had to have had some potential Hollywood blockbuster movie to have a story worth telling, because we've got a story worth telling because it's about how God has interacted with our lives. I don't know. All I know is that I was blind, but now I can see. That's what I do know. And I think I told you week one, for those of you who were here, about the guy that came and knocked on the door of my home, which led to my family becoming Christians. They'd been a Christian 6 days. I'm so glad he didn't say, "Well, what have I got to offer?" He didn't know the internet. He just knew this, that there was a moment when he was blind, and now he can see. And so let's not overly complicate it. We're going to look at some storytelling skills this evening. But the bottom dollar is, we're just trying to say to people, look, this is what I've experienced. This is what my life was like, and this is what it's like since. And so that's a great thing to be able to explore. And then, of course, he began to apply it to them. Now, I think this is the bit where maybe his lack of experience kind of showed through a little bit, because he hadn't quite learned sensitivity. Have you noticed that when people first become Christians, they don't know sensitivity, do they? They tell everything that's moving, and if it's not moving, they kick it so it is, and then they tell them. Yeah, they haven't learned those words like sensitivity. They've got an enthusiasm, haven't they? I mean, don't worry, we'll knock it out with them eventually. But in the first stages, in the first months, they're so enthusiastic. And so sometimes new Christians, they're not always that sensitive. They don't quite know how to handle things. And this was the case with this man. Like, they've been asking these questions, and I love it. Whenever I read the Bible, I always try and think about it as real people, because it's real people, right? So when I read it, I often see like the human emotion in this. And look, what's happened here in verse 27 is really interesting. That he's been healed, they've come to him, they've asked him questions. He said, I don't know how it's happened. So they go away and they ask his parents questions. And they say, well, God, why didn't you go and ask me as a age? So they come back to him and start asking him the same questions again. And we know it's that sometimes people can answer the same questions time and time again. And you're thinking, did we not talk about this before? And the same questions come out. And I think there's a bit of frustration in it here. He says, do you want to become his disciples too? Verse 27 earlier literally says, I've told you this already, and you didn't listen. Honestly, read your Bible, it's in there. There's this real, like, oh, for goodness sake, are we going over this again? Why are you asking me because you want to become a Christian too? It's a little bit frustrating. You pick that up. He's a bit frustrated. He's not got his sensitivity. He's a bit exasperated. Maybe there's a little bit of immaturity and is not kind of knowing how to handle questions and not knowing quite how to deal with people. And then he asks them, do you want to become his disciples? And he tells us that one by one, they began to leave. And I think that's the balance, isn't it? With sharing our testimony. And we'll unpack and explore this. It's so easy to move into a preach, into a challenge. And sometimes that's right. But I would say, as a general rule, just tell your story. Just tell your story about how once you were blind and now you can see it. We're going to look at some tips. But I don't have a testimony. And I can guarantee that there will be one or two people here that if Alex said, right, we're going to get you sharing your testimony on Sunday morning, one or two of you would say, well, I don't have a testimony. And if you don't have a testimony, please come and see me at the end, and I'll lead you to Jesus. I said that jokingly once, and actually somebody came up to me and said, actually, I don't have a testimony. And that's because they had been at week 1 where we explored the gospel. They realised they'd never really heard it before. Bonkers, isn't it? One of you thinks of a mature Christian coming to learn how to share a faith they don't have, but they only realised it, and so when I put that challenge out. So I say it jokingly, but there's a little bit of seriousness as well. If you don't think you've got a testimony, then let's get you knowing Jesus. Because the strength of our testimony is not us, it's him. That's a really, really important thing. And I think when people say they don't have a testimony, as I hinted at a few moments, what they mean is they weren't the head of a global crime ring by the age of 5. Do you know what I mean? They hadn't shot anybody or done this or robbed a bank. What they mean is, well, I've just kind of had a normal life. That's what people mean. I've not really got anything worth telling. That's what they really mean. But you know what? I'm just your average type of person. And I would suggest that probably, I don't know all your background, so I'm making a bit of an assumption here, but I would suggest that most of you, are probably just your average everyday people as well. We haven't done anything majorly bad. We might not have done anything majorly good. We might not have had massive failures, we might not have had massive successes. We're just your normal everyday people. Would that be fair? Who feels that they're just your normal everyday person? Give us a little show of hands. Yeah, just nothing spectacular about me. I mean, maybe some of you do look in the mirror and go, you're beautiful, all right? But by and large, thinking about life, okay, thinking about life, we're pretty well like the person next door, right? We might have a different job, a different background, but we're pretty well the same. So if I'm your average everyday person and I'm telling my story to most people, which by definition are your average everyday people, do not think that they've got more in common with my story than they have with the story who was the head of a global crime ring at the age of 5. So actually our testimony is really worth telling, because most of what we've experienced resonates with most of what everybody experiences. We all experience and carry similar things. And so I just want to say to you, you really have got a testimony worth telling. I'm always fascinated by adverts. I don't know if you are. Sometimes I get all of them, but I've noticed that a lot of adverts work on a similar principle. And the principle is this: that there's a situation, problem, and then there's something took place to cure the problem, and then this is the result of the problem solved. And many adverts follow a similar kind of rhythm to that. They tend to tell a story, don't they? You know, so for example, there was an advert a few years ago, Claims Direct. I haven't seen it recently, but you see this picture of, you know, somebody walking into a room that's just been freshly mopped, big office block, and they slip, fall over in a really bad acting way. And then you see this: have you slipped or had an accident at work? You seen the adverts? So they talk about the problem, and then they said, we are here to help you. No win, no fee basis. Yeah, right. Not just me, that's a bit cynical, is it? Right. It's that whole thing, if anything's too good to be true, or sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. And so they say, we can help you, this is what we'll do for you. And then it cuts to the end of an advert, and you see somebody who's having 3 weeks in Marbella because they've had this insurance payout. So you get this problem, this process that fixed it, and the result, Slim Fast. Anybody remember the Slim Fast adverts? Need to lose 84 stone in a week. You know that problem? This is not my own technically, by the way. Just for a little bit of clarity here. I do need to lose some weight in a week, but not that much. And so what they do is they pose this problem that a lot of people resonate with, and then he goes, this is what you need to do. You have a delicious nutrition, sorry, don't forget the nutrition, delicious nutritious steak for breakfast, delicious nutritious steak for lunch, and a normal evening meal. I want to tell you, that's not a normal evening meal that they're presenting. Little chopped potatoes and peas, that's not a normal. I want to suggest that the reason you're losing weight is nothing to do with the shake. It's that you're not eating. That's why you're losing weight. And have you ever tried those? They're not delicious. And I'm debating whether they're even nutritious. They probably are a shake, and that's the only accurate bit in the advert. But they show you out this person who had these massive trousers on. And they're stood there now. They're just stood in one leg. You see the result. Another one, Head and Shoulders. Their advert, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. Remember that advert? So what they show you is this person say, I had dandruff. They showed you a picture of their head covered in dandruff. And then I met Head and Shoulders. And this is what happened. They washed one half of my hair in Head and Shoulders, and the other half of my hair in a normal medicated shampoo. And now I look a real idiot because I've just got half a head full of dandruff. Doesn't even work, quite frankly. But they show you the problem, the process, and the result. And so actually this is a bit of a tried and tested thing. And it kind of shows a bit of an understanding of how human beings work. That we're presented with a problem, we need a solution, and we need to see the evidence that it's going to work before we commit to it. Similarly, we live our whole life on recommendations. So imagine I said to you at the end of this meeting, I'm going for a curry. There's a strong likelihood that could happen. Curry is my favourite food. And you would say, oh, where are you going? And I would say, oh, I'm going down to such and such a restaurant. Oh, no, you don't want to go there. This is where you want to go. Right. And dependent upon whether I respect you or trust you, would determine whether I listen to you. But the fact that you're saying, oh, you don't want to go there, or you hear bad reports about a place, so you'll advise somebody, no, don't go there. So our whole life is based on recommendations from our personal experience. So our testimony is simply that. John 1 verses 1 to 3 literally says that. We've heard, we've seen with our eyes, our hands have touched, and it's this that we proclaim. In other words, this is what I've experienced, and this is what I'm going to talk about. Our testimony is literally making recommendations to people about Jesus based on what we have experienced. It's for them to decide whether they're going to follow. We're just telling the story. So telling our testimony, it's quite important that we understand a few key things. First of all, it's not preaching the gospel message. Sometimes when I, as an evangelist, turn up to preach in a church, when it's an evangelistic meeting, I'll always encourage church to get somebody to share their testimony. It's really powerful. I love preaching at baptismal services. You hear all these amazing testimonies. And I'll always say to the minister, oh, if it's okay with you, I know you might baptize people at the end, but is it possible for the people being baptized to tell their testimony before I preach? Because I often refer to the testimonies that I've heard. Something really powerful about the word of the testimony, the blood of the Lamb. I recognize that Bible verse somewhere, don't you? Yeah, they overcame him by the power of their testimony, the blood of the Lamb. So when I think about the cross, the gospel is the blood of the Lamb. It's Jesus' death, our testimony. And it's a really, really powerful tool. Absolutely brilliant. So sometimes, though, when I've heard people tell their testimonies, they've started preaching their testimony. And I think, no, just tell the testimony. So we're going to look at in the second part of this evening. It's not preaching the gospel message. It's not teaching Bible doctrine. But of course, it must be doctrinally sound. We need to be right and not erroneous. But this guy, who'd only just met, he didn't understand it. He didn't even understand who Jesus was when he was telling his testimony. The woman at the well, she didn't fully understand who Jesus was, but she told what bit she did know. So we're not teaching Bible doctrine, and sometimes we can just get a little bit caught up in indiscipline. No, tell the story of your faith. It's not a parade of the flesh. Sometimes I listen to people tell their testimonies, and it's like they're hanging out all their dirty washing. It's like they just talk about all the stuff that they did before. And then they talk about, and then I became a Christian. And sometimes I think, you seem to have had a lot more fun before you were a Christian. Like you did all this stuff, but now you're a church. It's really random boring sometimes. So we want to really learn to get the balance. We want to talk about what we were like. That's really, really important. But if people come away and the only thing they remember is how bad we were, and nothing really powerful about Jesus, I think they've kind of got it wrong. So we're going to look at some stuff in the second half of this evening that just helps us to get that balance. And it's certainly not to glorify ourselves. We need to be honest. Remember hearing this story that I never knew whether this was quite true. And I told the story recently, like about 4 or 5 months ago. And there was actually somebody in the congregation who actually said they'd seen this. So they validated it. So this took place in America, where a gentleman was buying one of these, you know, these large motorhomes that they have in America that are like buses, called Winnebagos, I think, aren't they? Yeah. Huge, great big things. And he bought one. And I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase, when buying a vehicle, sometimes the phrase, this car will drive itself, is used. And it's meant to say it's a really smooth runner. It's a lovely car, comfortable car, easy to drive. So this guy bought this motorhome, and on the side of the motorhome, this Winnebagos, he said, this motorhome will drive itself. He took a photograph of it, and then he bought it, went out, took it on the American freeway, took it on cruise control, went behind to make a cup of coffee. Nobody laughed. The freeway went round to the left. The motorhome didn't. He carried on and went off the side of the road. It went to court, and he presented as evidence this sign that said, this motorhome will drive itself. And he got away with it. Can you believe it? I can, quite frankly. So we've got to be careful what messaging we're giving. We want to be honest, but we need to make sure that we communicate really, really well. So with that in mind then, just to take us to our coffee break, this tea and coffee break, which is up there for 5 or 10 minutes, but we break, and then we'll come back to finish off this evening's session. So a testimony is not to glorify ourselves. It is about how a person came to see their need of Christ. So yes, talk about what your life was like before you were a Christian, but make sure that you always bring people to the fact to the point that it never satisfied. There's always something missing, or I had a lot of money, but so make sure we tell people what brought us to the place where we saw our need of Christ. It is about how a person is putting their faith and trust in God, how a person got that place, that close. So it's about that. And then finally, just before we break, it is about how a person is experiencing God now. Now, often, when I listen to people tell their testimony story ends at the day they became a Christian, and they don't often say much beyond. And so I want to say to you, tell people what it's like, the good stuff and the bad, the downs. Somehow we feel that we've got to make Christianity look so good that we can end up presenting a false image. So it makes it look like become a Christian and all your problems will disappear. Is there anybody in this room that has experienced that? Not at all. Not at all. I still have to pay the bills, and much to my disappointment. But we're not immune now. In fact, my friend said, if the Christian life is a bed of roses, which is a phrase that is often used, he said, I must be sitting on the thorns because it's prickly, it's uncomfortable, there's pain, there's hardships there. So I'm a big believer that when you're sharing your testimony, talk about the times that you've had doubts about your faith as well. Be really transparent, really honest about it, be really real, be really vulnerable. Don't try to make it look like everything's okay, because actually what we do if we're not careful, and we looked at this last week as how we can distort the Christian message unintentionally, by not being honest, we can say without actually saying it, because we don't talk about how it's tough and how it's difficult, we can project this image that it's all okay. And I never have any doubts. But the truth is, many of us do. So be really frank, be really honest. How you're experiencing God now. And I talk about completed works and uncompleted works. I don't use that phrase out loud, but it comes from that scripture that says that you began a good work and you will complete it until the day of Christ. So that tells me that there's going to be some stuff that's going to get sorted. There's going to be some stuff that isn't going to get sorted. And so I make sure that when I'm telling my testimony, and again, we'll unpack this a little bit more in the second half, that I talk about, here's the definite difference that Jesus has made. I've still a little way to go, but I'm nowhere near what I used to be like. That's like definitely something that's been good, but here's a few other things that need a lot more work on. So I like to be really honest and just be really, really frank, because actually I think that authenticates our Christian faith. And let's face it, we want authenticity, not fakeness. And I think sometimes as Pentecostals, we can put our head in the sand a little bit. We can kind of shandai and kushundai our way through difficulties. But let's just be real. Like David, when he went out and saw Goliath, he didn't say, hallelujah, there is no giant. Did he? He looked at the giant and thought, I'm going to have you, son. I'm going to have you. Because my God's healthy with the bear and the lion. And you're only 3 feet taller than the bear. I'm going to have you. So he didn't ignore him. He didn't walk out and go, I don't receive Goliath. Don't receive him. He didn't say his back, but he's not there. No, he looked at him, saw the reality of the situation, but knew that his God was bigger. I think that's what I want to say. Let's not be fake. Let's be really honest and transparent about some of the challenges we're facing in life, but let's also share about the fact that we know how God's going to get us through life because he's done it thus far. Ooh, that almost felt like a little preach, didn't it? Let's do a little appeal now, I think. But instead of appeal, let's have a cup of tea and coffee and 10 minutes, and then we're back to the final bit of the evening. Don't forget, we've got the resources here if you want to buy any of these.